Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in I Am the Truth by Henri, published by Stanford University Press in 2003, first published in France in 1996. We've looked at the overall system, and now we're going to take a look at what are the implications for a doctrine of man with regard to this phenomenological system. So now, what are the consequences of the system we just studied in that comprehensive lesson? So doctrine of man, we begin with block 1. Man is huios. And Henri tells us we begin by bracketing naturalism. How is man, as distanced from God, capable of finding him again? We must bracket naturalism because man is open to world through relational experience. Man is a transcendental being of the world. So as transcendental being of the world, man is capable of having a world, of constructing and having a world. And man cannot turn away from this world. He is fundamentally linked to it. The world shows itself to man, and the appearing of world constitutes the world's truth. It shows its truth as the phenomena that the self will internalize and interpret. So under the appearing of the world, the possibility of knowledge resides in the event of manifestation. The self can then thematize the instances of appearing. Then they become the appearance of truth, all taking place within the pathos embrace as huioi sons, or huioi children of God. This completely overturns naturalism's limited concept of man. But it's all about the complete process of manifestation as an event of manifestation. You've got the appearance of the world, you've got its internalization in the self, and its interpretation by the self, which creates an event of manifestation. But it takes place, and I love this term from Henri, it takes place within the pathos embrace as children of God in note 4. Christian truth defines man as the transcendental man. Man is the transcendental man. He is posited as huios, a belonging that's within the absolute life of God himself. Man is born of phenomenological life. Therefore, anything said about the ark son of Christ also concerns man himself. So note 5, this being taken up into the ark son of Christ. Christ is the firstborn, engendered within God himself, and Christ constantly subordinates his will to that of the Father. Christ becomes the model of conduct with regard to our own possibility of access to God's kingdom. Christ proceeds from the self-generation of the absolute life of the Father. Christ, remember, he is in that radical interiority with the Father in a reciprocal communion. Then we are taken up into the Son and share in that radical interiority of living within the self-effectivity of God himself. We are invited in through the mediation of Christ. Now we need to take a look at the concrete side of this. What does it mean to be born within phenomenological life in block 2? How does this look in a concrete way? We've looked at the theoretical in block 1, the theoretical notion of huios. Now, what does that mean in a concrete way? Note 1, identity is on the basis of Christ. A man must be understood on the basis of Christ. Then Henri gives us the axiom, life has the same meaning for God, for Christ, and for man. Life that self-generates itself within God also generates the selfhood of man. We are huios sons within the absolute life, within the essence of the divine life. Our selfhood is constituted within the essence of the divine life. So take a look at Note 2, Block 2, Note 2. Man is defined as huios of God, huios theos, huios tou theou, children of God, child of God. Our horizon of truth is the assertions Christ made about himself. In John 17:14, he says that we are not of the world, just as Christ is not of the world. The world has no flesh. It is outside itself. Well, no living is possible, says Henri. Only life's pathos embrace by Christ conveys life. Only being taken up in the pathos embrace of Christ will endow us with life, new life. And so identity through pathos embrace in Note 3. No worldly sequence of events can account for the being of a person. Within the transcendental life, the essence of man unfolds in the light of conscious premises. But consciousness, says Henri, is only that moment of phenomenological opening, that moment when we discover the ecstasy of the outside. So being born again or being born from above is, in Note 4, the moment of phenomenological opening. God created man in his own image. That means what is valid for the arc sun is valid for the self as well, which means God as the essence of life. And then Henri gives us the following axiom. Within God's self-engendering life, the selfhood of man is engendered also. In this new birth, the entire reign of the visible is revealed to us. It is made manifest. It is made manifest. So the reign of the visible in Note 5, the usual sense of the idea of man must be renounced, says Henri, because it lacks the living of the absolute transcendental life of God. The man born into new life takes up the pathos characteristics of transcendental life. We are the living transcendental self. We are the living transcendental self, as taken up in the huios arc sun. So as the living transcendental self, our selfhood is engendered as singular self, making us true man or real man, carried within the absolute coming into itself of God that exists as a never abolished premise. What is specific to life is that it affects itself. Life affects itself. That's a key term for Henri. So let's take a look at that term in Note 7. The world manifests itself to the self as world truth, but self-affection means that nothing foreign to the self can affect it. Nothing foreign to the self can affect its real life. Life is that which itself affects itself, constituting its own content through a radical interiority. And here's a key note. Each modality of life carries with it the absolute essence of life. We're involved in a radical interiority of these modalities of life that reflect the pathos of the embrace of Christ and his self-giving love. So we're ready now to draw this chapter to a close and look at the conclusions that Henri gives us about what does it mean to realize the real self? What does it mean to actualize the real self? Let's take a look at Block 3, a very critical conclusion to this chapter. We begin with the pathos embrace. The self-affecting self is transcendental affecting, as self-revelation, as a pathos at the very depth of our being, within the pathos embrace of Jesus Christ, as absolute life's generation of life. The self draws its own selfhood from life's self-affection. This entire process of God going out of himself through the Son and then lifting us up into his own life self-affection constitutes our selfhood. So note 2, the self becomes affected by the content of God's self-affection. The self takes part in the condition of experiencing that is a power of being, not arising from the self, but as a transcendence within, as an affection that is felt in that pathos embrace of Christ. There's a 5-part process of being affected, says Henri. This transcendence is felt, desired, thought, and then willed, and then posited. The entire process. We feel it as it is internalized. We desire to bring it forth in the world. We think through the eidos ideas that it implies, and then we will it to be concrete through positing. So the self finds itself in being affected. So our conclusive comment is block 3, note 3, the self finds itself in being affected. The self is affected within the eternal process of the absolute self-affecting of God as self-enjoyment, because absolute life is self-affected within ourselves, within the self, because God's life is one of self-giving. He gives himself to us through his Son, mediated through the self-revelation of his Son. Therefore, the triad unfolds as follows. Here's your summary triad. We begin with self-affecting, the self-affecting life of God himself. And then we have the self-giving embrace. God goes out of himself in the self-revelation of Jesus Christ. That realizes the indwelling the self as a self-giving spirit. God is a loving, agape, self-giving God. And that establishes the real self in note 4. The self-giving life is the absolute life of God, which creates the possibility for the self to become real self. The self is passive with regard to every modality of pathos, passive relation to eternal process. It is a phenomenologically determined passivity. A phenomenologically determined passivity. So let's take a look at that concept. The self experiences the feeling of being lived. We feel God living his power through us. The specific modality of passivity abbreviates the conceptual pathos modalities, and they are anxiety, the inability to escape the self, drive, the effort of self-effective life, and action of suffering as the principle of positing. Anxiety, drive, and action. Now these set of modalities, if you take a look at note 6, as huios, man is predestined within the radical interiority of the self-affection of God himself, within the life of God himself. Christ as mediator takes on phenomenological understanding. Within God, Christ is the arc son of man's essential selfhood. So if we take a look at this notion in note 7, Christ is co-substantial with the Father, sharing the power of self-generation, and the concept of transcendental man is made intelligible in light of Christ's relationship to the Father. And here's your key conclusion. The self can only become huios within the life of the arc son. Only in Christ are we taken up into this gift of being a child of God. So self as huios. The transcendental arc son is co-engendered along with the self as a phenomenological realization of God himself. Place is opened up within Christ himself for the self and our realization of our real selfhood. The arc son is our pre-established and our predestined essence. There's your predestination. The arc son is our pre-established and predestined essence. Our lives flow into the arc son like a wave. Phenomenological effectiveness is situated in the life of the Ark Son, Jesus Christ. This chapter is all about, it immediately follows that composite that we had in pages 1 to 94. Now that we know his composite phenomenology, now it gives us the consequence of his doctrine of man. It is a doctrine that says that we are the huioi, we are the children of God, through the Ark Son, through being born within phenomenological life. And in that way, we reach the realization of real self. By being taken up into a place given us by grace, a place within the Son, Jesus Christ, what Henri calls the Ark Son. But as we are embraced by Christ, Christ is embraced in that radical interiority with the Father. Therefore, the entire self-engendering process of the Father takes up the Son and all those in the Son. Just reflect on John chapter 17, that prayer that Christ made concerning believers, that we are in Him as He is in the Father, and we are not of the world as He is not of the world. So, tremendous lesson on the Doctrine of Man. That's pages 94 to 112. We'll pick up next time in page 113.